it's 5, and that's, square. It's round number.
We can wait a few more seconds till it's officially 7:05.
Okay, that seems fair.
Seems appropriate.
It does. Actually, we blew shofar for our recording because, first day Rosh Hashanah is on Shabbat, so we can't have shofar blowing in any of our services that are live that day. But since our family services are pre-recorded,
nice.
Shofar blowing on
and
Rosh
children
Hashanah.
Don't know the difference.
Oh yeah, but it's still, I wouldn't. If we'd actually done family services live, we wouldn't have had shofar blowing on Shabbat because it's Shabbat. So it's kind of nice. I do have to say, and it's not Shabbat today. Can I blow shofar for us now? We're saving questions till the end. Somehow we won't get to that one.
I feel like shofar is like the secret skill that everyone should be working on now.
Are you saying you're working on it right now?
No, because I know my skills and weaknesses, but what better time than now?
Yeah, this is why I brought it. It's really cute. We have a grandfather and a bunch of his grandkids, so it's really cute. I'm excited. And
all right, you ready to go?
Yeah, we're always ready to talk about feminism.
Yeah.
All right, welcome everybody who is here. This is so exciting. Yes, true, not everyone's heard shofar yet, true. Welcome everybody who is here and everyone who is filing in, which is really exciting, and everyone who is coming. We'll be excited to let them come in a little bit later. I am Rabbi Sarah Fort. I'm the assistant rabbi at Congregation Beth Yeshurun. For the few of you who do not know who the heck I am and what I'm doing here, and I am joined by my friend and UOS and Museum Minion member, Alicia Clappoltz, who's also volunteer at our community mikveh, which is housed at UOS. And we are so excited to be having a conversation that, frankly, we've been having conversations about feminism and egalitarianism for years, just because we're friends and it's something that's very interesting to us. And then, we thought, let's just have this conversation in public. And because it came up in something else that I had done, and everyone just had a lot of questions. And I thought, I should bring in someone who has a different kind of experience. We have a very similar experience in a lot of ways, but we diverge in a lot of ways. And I was like, I should bring in someone else and we can talk about this, and it'll be really interesting to people. So this is, for the most part, a conversation that we're having. But if you have questions, if something comes up and you think, oh yeah, I've always wanted to ask, or I've always wanted to know, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. And you can kind of send them to, everyone, or you can just send them to Jennifer Rosenzweig, who is our program director, and she'll be kind of collecting the questions, and we will go through as many as we can at the end. So if you have any questions, just send them to Jennifer, and she will be happy to dole those out to us at the end. And when she's not doing that, she'll be moderating. So with that, I'm going to throw it over to Jennifer.
All right. Well, let's start with this. Who are you? You gave us a little glimpse of that. And how did you come to your place in the community?
And I'll make Alicia first because I just talked a bunch.
And she's drinking tea, so you go first.
And there you go.
I'm Alicia Clappoltz. For a lot of you people who probably don't know me, I work at Congregation Emmanuel. I also am a member at UOS. I'm a member of the Museum Minion at Beth Yeshurun. I also help run an independent minion here in Houston, which is a little bit on hiatus, as many of us are during the pandemic. And I help run the mikveh that is housed at UOS, our lovely community mikveh. So if anybody has any questions or wants to know anything about mikveh after this, I'm your girl. So a little bit of the story about me is that I grew up in a traditional conservative congregation. My family was very much a high holidays only, and I hit bat mitzvah, and then that was kind of it. I sort of came to observance as an adult when I was living in China, as you do, after college.
You never know.
And then, it was a community that was filled with a bunch of chassids and people who were just kind of, it was very Chabad. And I went very far to the right in my observance. It wasn't super comfortable for me. It wasn't really my place. I moved back to the US. I lived in New York, in Washington Heights, which is sort of the center of where a lot of the liberal modern orthodoxy is kind of going on, like Drisha and Jofa and a lot of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah students. They were all living there. And that's kind of where I found my place. And I'm a little bit more, I would say, somewhere in the like middle to liberal, within the modern Orthodox camp. And if you make me choose a box within Judaism, I'm going to choose Orthodox feminist.
It's a good place to arrive at, I would say.
Yeah.
Like I said, I'm Rabbi Sarah Fort, as the assistant rabbi at Congregation Beth Yeshurun, which is a pretty big conservative synagogue here in Houston. For those who are joining us today, we have folks kind of like from all over. And I grew up in the middle of nowhere, but we went to Sholag every week. We kept like a kind of kosher in the home, and we went conservative. And both my parents grew up conservative. I grew up conservative. And I realized I always was interested in observance, in kind of traditional observance. And I became more and more observant, especially after college. And I started to kind of go down what would have been like a Ba'at Tshuva path. And I think I kind of just had like a bit of a reckoning moment where I realized that if I continued down this path of becoming more and more observant and really kind of investing myself in the I kind of was kind of kicking around like the Orthodox community in Baltimore, and because I was living in Northern Virginia at the time, DC area, and I just had to have a moment where I realized by going down this path I was going down, in a lot of ways I was going to feel so spiritually fulfilled and so comfortable and at home. But there was a huge part of me that I would not be able to access, and that I felt like fundamentally was not how I felt like God was expressed, the way I felt like God really wanted me to live my life, to be like very honest about it. That when it came to something like women and what women could do and what women were obligated to do, I just felt like I would have to ignore and change such a huge part of myself to be in this community that was so observant. That way I really felt like I needed to be. It wasn't worth it. And so I kind of gave up the community and gave up that level of observance and that kind of observance, and just like did a 180 and went to rabbinical school instead. And then I became a conservative rabbi. And so if you asked me to put myself in a box, I would very comfortably say I am a conservative Jewish feminist and quite rabid egalitarian.
Which is a perfect segue into the next question. What is the difference between feminism and egalitarianism?
Oh. I think in a lot of ways people think of these as being the same term, and I'm always trying to differentiate. But I feel like for Alicia, this is more for you to talk about, because when I talk to people, they don't think you have to be both. Like one necessarily prescribes the other. If you're a feminist and you're like, I am for the rights of women and the advance of women, and we're talking specifically Jewish, life and law, then we're for egalitarianism. Like women should be allowed to do the same things as men. And not all that.
I don't know. I think that the two are different. I think that they're very similar, but they're different. To me, like I think of feminism as the sort of secular idea that women are not bound by these traditional roles. I'll also say, like, I don't consider myself egalitarian. I am one of the people who doesn't care, like, if I'm in a space, I think, where there are egalitarian things going on, which is why I can sort of, be in the sort of fluid spaces that I am in Jewishly. But for me, egalitarianism is about creating equal space and about like making things equal between men and women. that might just be like my own interpretation. And like, I also want to be clear that like, I am not representing all of Orthodoxy here. I am not representing like, there's such a huge umbrella within Orthodoxy. And I'm only really representing my own like opinions and personal experience here.
Right. No, it's the same thing with conservative. Like, you know, I could say like, I am representing my own lived experience as a woman who is a conservative Jew and a feminist and an egalitarian, and that's my experience. But even within the conservative movement is a spectrum, period. And when it comes to women and what women can do and what women are obligated to do, you could find 5 different Jews who all identify as conservative who all do drastically different things. Actually, we're not a monolith.
But I think that feminism works within Orthodox spaces because it's about like sort of breaking down like what is it that women can do, even if they're not obligated, even if they are, isn't what was traditionally done, but making space for women, allowing for women's leadership, allowing for women's voices to be heard. Like that for me is about, that's how it's different, that it doesn't have to be equal. It doesn't have to be the same. And you don't have to compromise, I think, in a way in creating women's spaces. There's a lot that can be done to create women's spaces and have women's voices heard in spaces that are not egalitarian.
Yeah, I definitely see that. And I lived in LA and there were synagogues that did, you could see like, oh, we have a men's space and a women's space. And for me, I knew it wouldn't work for me. That's such a big part for me, as for a lot of people, but I don't know if everyone really thinks about it like to this extent of this detail, but the feminism and the egalitarianism are kind of woven together where you don't even know like where one ends and the other one begins. That part of advancing women, because we have been so historically in life and in Judaism specifically, we have, I really think, so historically been pushed to the back and held back and pulled back in so many ways that if we're going to say women are able and should be allowed to flourish and encouraged to flourish and obligated to flourish as much as men, we need to look at what is the nature of egalitarianism. And it's that women need to be allowed to and perhaps even held accountable to the same extent that men are. For me, that was just so fundamental. For me, it doesn't have to be for you, but for me, it was so fundamental, kind of just how I understood God working and Judaism afterwards. God first.
For me, like the hard part is like that I have to often like keep showing up and saying like, no, you're wrong. Like women could be heard here. Like women have a space here. Like that for me is a little bit of the hard part of the sort of difference between feminism and egalitarian. But I think of feminism as a mostly secular idea, really.
Oh, wait, interesting. Say more about that. What do you mean?
Yeah.
What do you mean by how like feminism is a secular?
Well, because I think that it's really kind of like a secular value that we are bringing into a religious space, at least within Orthodoxy. Like I don't feel that I need to have, the same exact equal like standing with a man, but like I want to make sure that like women can go, and daven, that women can go and be heard. Because I can't like. There were many times that I showed up with my children in shul when they were babies, and not just here, like many different Orthodox communities, and I was sort of looked at and shunned. And I don't know that people are even like conscious that they're doing it.
You think it's just like a subconscious, like it's just a reaction?
Yeah, but like I feel like I often have to show up and say like, no, like women can do this. Like women can have a say here. I'm not tired yet. I might get tired.
That's an interesting aspect of the conversation, is like check back with us in 10 to 30 years and we'll see how, I don't know, Blue Greenberg's still going strong.
I know. I look at some of her books from like the early 80s and I'm like, we're still having the same fight. Like, how is this happening?
That's a whole other aspect of this conversation. How come we're still having this fight that started before I was born?
I was alive, but I was little.
Yeah, no, I came in at the tail end there. Still counts. Just saying. Anyway.
Yeah.
What else you got, Jennifer?
All right. Where does the idea that women can't do the same things as men Jewishly come from?
Let's talk halacha. I feel like for so many people, if you ask them like, oh, can women do the same things as men? They would say like, well, like in Judaism. And they'd be like, well, no. And you're like, okay, but why? Like, because it's not done, because it's so ingrained, I think. It's just the idea that like, women don't do that. Women don't wear talit. Women don't wear kippah. Women don't go to shul. Women don't hear shul. Like, women don't do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there is a whole system in place for how did we get to where we are today that started thousands of years ago. This discussion is not a recent one. The idea like it just comes down to a mitzvah she'asa b'zman grama, something that a positive time-bound commandment. There's like 4 kinds of Jewish things you have to do, and there's positive, thou shalt, and negative, thou shalt not. Don't murder, don't steal. And there's ones that are not time-bound, so they apply all the time. Don't ever murder, etc. Keep kosher all the time. And then there's time-bound, so you can only do them in a certain time. If you can't, I mean, you could hear shofar, I guess, ever, but when does it count for shofar? Shofar counts, on Rosh Hashanah. When does eating matzah count? Eating matzah counts on Passover. So women as well as slaves and children, were declared exempt from having to do positive time-bound commandments by the rabbis, ancient rabbis, like 1,000+ years ago. And that, in a lot of ways, that's not the only thing. Like, we could talk about like tzniut, we could talk about everything related to modesty stuff, but in terms of women wearing tefillin and women feeling, all these different things, it comes down to a lot of positive time-bound commandments that women were declared exempt from, which then became women are prohibited from doing. So that was just, I feel like that's like the huge departure that our ancient rabbis said, women are exempt from doing X, Y, Z because they are positive commandments, you shall, and time-bound, you have to do them in a certain time. And that became, they're exempt from doing it. The idea being like, if you're a woman in ancient times, as now, you have to take care of children, you have to take care of the house. So you can't be beholden to the clock the way a man is apparently fine with, according to the ancient rabbis. And that became, you are prohibited from doing these things. So that's a whole discussion about why that became.
So I think that conservative and Orthodox sort of, they started in similar places with that. Like, I don't know about the conservative community that you grew up in, but the conservative community that I grew up in was super traditional. Like, women did not get an aliyah. They were not allowed to go up to the Torah. I specifically remember I think I was about 12 when they finally made the change. And so that would have been like early 90s. That women could go up for an aliyah with their husband. So like, I think that, conservative and Orthodox at least came from somewhat similar places with these time-bound things. For me, in terms of women and men having sort of, that they can't do the same things, they come from a few very specific places. There's the time-bound mitzvot, the positive time-bound mitzvot that you're talking about. There's no women singing. I was trying to look up, like, what is the halacha, like, where's the halachic basics?
Kol isha.
Well, yeah, kol isha, like the woman's voice.
Woman's voice.
And then also sarara. And this one's
like,
actually my
I've never even
favorite.
heard of before. I don't even know. I consider myself like pretty well read, especially when it comes to women's. I don't know what that is.
So like sarara is this like really like, it's a halacha, like a Jewish law that exists, and a lot of like sort of prohibitions against women doing things come down to this, whether or not people are aware of it. And sarara is leadership or kingship, like appointing for yourself a king. And women were not allowed to be that. And so then, of course, the rabbis have interpretations, like, what does this mean? What can women do or not do? And, the reason that I find this like super perplexing is that like you have these modern Orthodox communities where Like, women have leadership roles. They're physicians, they're judges, they're like professors, they're professionals, and they lead in their secular lives. And you turn around and you say to them, like, no, you can't lead within the religious world because of Sarara. Like, we accept this within the secular world, but we don't accept it within the religious world. And I think that this really has like a lot of ramifications that people aren't aware of even now. Like, Young Israel as a national organization, which they are an as a national organization, they're Orthodox,
Right.
and some some are a little bit more to the right, a little bit more black hat, yeshivish, like whatever sort of label you want to throw on them than others. They still don't allow women as a national organization to be shul presidents.
There are really surprising. Are you surprised to know this? I'm not surprised. That's not shocking.
This is shocking.
That's so funny. I like it. You're just like, this is one. I'm like, yeah, okay.
It's absurd. Like, it's absurd that like you have women who can be like doctors,
disagree.
But like, you won't let them be your shul president. There are some Young Israels that have like gone against like the national charter and basically we're like, yeah, we're gonna have a woman be our shul president.
Going rogue, Young Israel going rogue.
I know, but it's like women, like in a lot of Orthodox congregations, I think until more recent years, also could not be on the board. Like, and it's sort of like, for me, I find it frustrating when you're not talking about just like the davening experience, like the Torah, the learning of Torah, the leading, things like that, like being on the board, like deciding, like, why should a bunch of men decide what the experience is for women?
I mean, I just like pause, and that's like a whole bigger conversation about thinking about all the other aspects of life, both religious and secular, where you have people making decisions for other people, and those other people have no voice in it. Yeah. And that's not.
But yeah, that's like the same. But Sarara is the argument used for like why women cannot be clergy within Orthodoxy.
So like,
I mean,
yeah,
like we're starting to
because
see a shift in that, but like.
Well, yeah, yes, we are starting to see a shift in women taking on clergy roles in Orthodox synagogues, but like the fight for women and clergy roles, specifically like leadership, like I don't think there was ever a rule. I'm trying to think now. I've read through a lot of the tshuvot, a lot of the legal rulings, because conservative because it's not like people say Orthodox, like Orthodox is a monolith. Like the Orthodox do this, like no, the Orthodox don't do anything. Like there's a lot of different groups that are Orthodox, but they're not all. Conservative as a movement, like we are a movement, and we have a committee of Jewish laws and standards, CJLS, and it is like literally a group of rabbis who all meet and work over tshuvot and decide. So like musical instruments and shul. Sometimes it's stuff where you're like, who cares about that? Like, okay, additives and cheese, and does that make it meat? And which is important, but not as important as our women people. So then I'm trying to think. I don't think we have any tshuvot that were issued by the movement saying about women. There might be. I don't know if someone looks it up and then tells me I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. But I don't think there were like, could women be shul presidents? But I think you just didn't see it happening in a lot of places until the women's movement really took off in this country. Like I think when women started to enter public civil service in this country, and when the women's movement, women's lib, I think then you start to see women presidents in conservative shuls. I don't think there was ever a rule against it in a lot of places. I think it just didn't happen. And no, but the rabbi thing is a whole other beast in conservative movement. It's not a Sarara thing. It's about like a dude, and like how do women qualify as witnesses, and can a woman count as a witness on a ketubah, and like how could you have a rabbi officiate a wedding when they couldn't actually count as a witness at that wedding, because women aren't in Orthodox, in like in the classic interpretation of halakha, women don't count as a dean, like you're not actually a valid witness, so how could you possibly be a rabbi? And there's the issue, I mean, it all for us, it all comes down to like positive time-bound commandments, because there is, that if you are not bound to, if you are not obligated to carry out a mitzvah, then you can't make other people yotzei. You can't help like other people count. We all have the commandment, the obligation, the mitzvah It's you.
So can I ask a question that I think would help explain like one of the differences I think between conservative and orthodox
Sure.
on this maybe? Like what does the conservative movement say about women laying tefillin?
The tefillin thing, first there's the really, and you know how wrong this is, the idea that, you know, you can't touch pieces of Torah scripture because that's what's in tefillin because you could be on your period and it makes everything dirty.
And on the Kabbalah tumor.
I know. Yes, nothing can unkosher cloth, Torah, tefillin, anything. I was thinking to people like God's word is more powerful than a period, so you can all just relax. It's fine. So there's that misguided idea that just had to be fought against, and there is the idea that it's something that men wear, and there is that line in the Torah that, you know, you can't wear other genders' clothes, which they worked through because it's not clothing. And then there's the, you know, the commandment. It says in the Torah, which we interpret pretty clearly, you know, thou shalt wear tefillin, essentially. More or less it says that. And then the issue is, but you can't wear tefillin all the time, and it is a positive time-bound commandment. So as a movement, we had to break it down to its component parts and say, okay, well, it's, what if it applies to not just men? What if when God says, you have to do this, you is everybody? And then so that's like one tack you could take is actually everybody's obligated. That's the radical tack. And then there's the other tack of like, well, it's not really positive time-bound commandment. There is that explanation.
I mean, if it was really like time-bound, you wouldn't have all these Chabad guys standing on the corner saying, did you lay tefillin today?
In the airport, in the shug. I mean, it's sort of time-bound. I mean, it's in that you don't wear them at night, kind of a thing. Like, you know, there is a certain time in which you can do it. But it's really just taking apart the idea of positive time-bound commandments and saying, and also going back to like, are women prohibited from doing this, or are they simply exempt from doing this? And they're like, for almost everything, they pull it back to women are exempt. And so this is like kind of an older school thinking of conservative movement, but it's no less valid today, even if it's not the one that I personally ascribe to. And it's not, it is certainly valid, saying like, okay, just because women aren't commanded to do this doesn't mean that they are prohibited from doing. So that's how it happens. The issue is, and I don't know how they could get around this, because you can't be a shaliach tzibor, you can't lead people in prayer if you can't make them yotze, if you don't make them count as doing their prayers. And how do you have then a female prayer leader for men?
So, I mean, like, I think to sort of, you know, with the example of like laying tefillin, like the difference I think in the Orthodox sort of side of this, you know, when I asked about it, when I was thinking about it, I was told essentially like, you really shouldn't do it. Also, like, first of all, just to take a step back, the difference in the process is like in Orthodoxy, like normally when you would want to like do something, like you might go and ask a rabbi a question about like kind of how to do that instead of just deciding to take things on your own. And so I asked, you know, a rabbi, a friend of mine, and I said, like, I'm thinking about doing this. I'm thinking about laying tefillin. Like, how should I go about this? And the answer that I was given was essentially like, you really shouldn't. You're a woman. But if you're going to, you have to treat it as a serious halachic process, like a serious thing of Jewish law. And you can't just decide like, oh, I'm going to wake up one day and do it. Oh, I'm going to wake up and like, I'll do it maybe like 3 days a week. Like, you have to decide that if you're going to do it, you're going to do it every day.
Right, because halakhically, if you decide that you're taking something on, and like then you've made the decision, like you have made that commitment halakhically, you have to, and now you're saying that you are obligated, and that's like as conservative, you say, okay, now that if you've decided you're obligated in davening, doing prayers 3 times a day, then you're obligated, which means if you're obligated, now you can be a leader in prayer for other people, regardless if they are men or they are women. That's how the conservative movement took that to that place, which would be different. Your mileage may vary. Your Orthodox mileage may vary. Will vary.
Yes, many people would get a very different answer, but that was the answer I was given. But that's also what happens when you ask your friend who's the rabbi.
Always have a rabbi friend who likes you and will.
I have more rabbis in my cell phone than I even know.
I probably do too. I need more normal people. I miss normal people. I mean, I married a rabbi, so, you know, helps a choice. But he's one of the good ones. I like him, actually. Just kidding. I love rabbis.
Okay, so I think that we probably covered most of this question, but just in case there's anything else you want to mention, what do the Orthodox and conservative movements say about women's leadership in prayer and community? I think we got a lot of that, but anything else you want to?
Yeah, we did talk a lot about it.
I have a couple things I would add to that. That the Orthodox communities in general are going to say like no to women's leadership in terms of prayer, and the community, like the sort of secular things, that's a separate issue that we talked about. But one of the ways that you'll see some of the leadership happening is women's tefillah groups, women's Torah readings, and women's Megillah readings. So women's tefillah groups, women's prayer groups, those were a lot more common, I think, like in the 1980s. Like when I moved to Washington Heights in New York, and like I asked around, and I was like, oh, like where are the women's spaces, kind of.
They're like,
and they were like, I mean, there's like a women's tefillah group, but it's the same like women who've been meeting since the 1980s. Like you don't really want to go there. And I was kind of like, oh, okay. So that was sort of and then women's Torah and Megillah readings, it's sort of like women can lead and do these things, but only for an audience of women.
Right.
And you cannot have more than 9 men present, and there are different ways that they.
Really?
Yeah.
I've heard, I always thought that we're not talking about partnership.
Well, different communities handle it differently. Like some communities will say like you can't have more than 9 men present if a woman is like leading in any way. Some will just say like you can be there, but you can't daven with that group. So you need to do all of your davening before you get there.
Oh yeah.
Well, like hot mitzvahs and things like that. And you know, sometimes the communities will say like, we don't want to tell you that you can't have your male family members there, but like we need to be clear that like this is not their space really. This is really a women's space. Sometimes they'll do things like women don't make the same bracha, the same blessing when they're going up for an aliyah, going up for like a Torah reading. And so these are some of the differences, that ways that they will like tweak it, that I think you would probably not see in a conservative or liberal Jewish space.
No, I mean, no. I mean, look, even the shul, no, but I'm thinking of like when you do a wedding, and like when I do weddings for couples, I always say, you know, like, okay, so for assuming that it's a man and a woman, like this whole conversation is very hetero, cishet conversation.
Oh, very much so.
Which is shocking. But when I have a couple and it's a man and a woman, it's a man, I always say, you're going to see the harayat line, you know, it's the line, it's all the Jewish values you're saying. For the woman, I say like, well, you have options, because I said harayata and just did that version. But I also know that for a lot of women, they just aren't comfortable saying the same thing then. And if you were Orthodox, if you had like a really classical read, you couldn't, because you can't have double kinyan. So, you know, it's not how it works. So, and I understand that. Again, I disagree with it. It doesn't work for me. But I do see
from the traditional sort of perspective, it sort of invalidates what's being said.
Right. Yes. Traditionally speaking, you can't there's no mutual acquiring going on. Somebody acquired, like it is acquiring. That's the language of marriage in Judaism. And I just had a very radical ketubah, but you know, that's me. It's actually not radical in defense of my own ketubah, which is hanging on the wall right over there. It's based on when they founded the Cairo Geniza. So in my defense, it's really old and traditional. There were no conservative Jews back then that we know of.
Yeah, I just had like a kind of radical wedding where like, and my mother-in-law's listening, but like under the chuppah, we it was all men who made the Sheva Brachot, the 7 blessings, and then during benching, like after the meal, when we were saying the blessing after the meal, it was all women who made the Sheva Brachot.
That's kind of cool. I like it.
Because like that's a modern Orthodox thing on it, where like you won't have men and women read them together, but you could have women.
Right. It's like what I would think of if I had to think of, you know, what would be such a key difference between like, you know, a conservative way of doing this and a Orthodox way that one could do this would be as conservative, like, okay, men, women, if they're saying the 7 blessings, the Sheva Brachot during a wedding, after, whatever, then they do it. And like, how could we do this in a feminist way that's Orthodox, feminist, and true to that is have the men do it the first set during the wedding, actual ceremony, and then after, do the Sheva Brachot after the meal, the women do it. It's a very clever Orthodox feminist way to work. I like it. Not my thing, but I do appreciate. I 100% appreciate it. This you know, I would say the Sarah who was like going down the Bala Tshuva thing would approve, but the Sarah going to the Bala Tshuva would never go to a wedding or a woman doing Sheva Brachot. So it's so funny because just to get an idea of the perspective, like when I lived in LA, there was a very modern, it's LA, very modern Orthodox shul, the B'nai David Young Judea. Great. I love that shul. I love their Rabbi Kanevsky. He's fantastic. And we would go for Purim. My husband is a great Jew. He doesn't really like Purim. I mean, he likes Purim, but he doesn't like Megillah readings. Because, the Megillah reading, everyone's like loud and there's a million people and there's kids running around and people are usually drunk and it's just like too much. And he's like, I want to hear Megillah, which is the only thing I have to do in that particular case. And I want to go home. And, everyone has their own thing. And so when we lived in LA, we would go to the Megillah reading, the women's Megillah reading at B'nai David, because as after like the main Megillah reading, and then it's huge, there's a million people, it's crazy loud, lots of people drunk, kids, whatever. And they would all file out. And then we would be arriving, we'd say, hi to everyone, hi. And then we would go in Megillah reading, it was all women. And the most of the people there attending were women, though there were men. Obviously, Ariel was there. He liked it because it was just straight Megillah reading and not a lot of craziness. So he really liked that. But if I'd stayed on my kind of like Bala Tshuva path, very, very, very observant, kind of like very classical sense of observant. Like in Baltimore, as I was going, like there would not have been a women's Megillah reading. I was never expected to go to shul on Friday nights because they're like, no, you have to be home. But like, I remember once I went to like a shiur, I went to like a Torah talk lecture before mincha, and then like I did, like, would just then stay for mincha, the afternoon service, and everybody sat together actually on like the men's side. On the men's side, everyone sat together for the shiur, and then like, okay, we finished. Other ways, you guys were interesting. Now let's go into mincha, and I had to like, oh right, I have to get out of here. I have to go all the way back down to the women's side, but they were like stacking chairs there, so I was like, where do I go? And they're like, oh, we hadn't thought of women would be just staying for mincha. Sorry. Let's move the chairs out of our way. Big difference. Two Orthodox shuls. Yeah. And then I became a conservative rabbi. Anyway.
Yeah.
All right, next question. Ready? As priorities shift in the broader feminist movement, how have they shifted in the Orthodox and conservative communities?
Oh, this is where we become very different. This is where... Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on what part you're at. I don't know. You talk.
Okay, I mean, like I don't know that I can tie it as well to the broader feminist movement, even though I probably should. But basically, like as you reach each of your goals, you kind of keep shifting the goal further. And so like, of course you're gonna, move the goalpost. So like earlier goals, I think, of the Orthodox feminist movement, were women's tefillah groups. And the sort of like edgy goal within that was like women's Torah and Megillah readings. And I think now it's sort of like women's Torah and Megillah readings, like, thank God, in a way, like my children are growing up in a world where like, that's a normal thing. Like, even if it has like these sort of modifications to fit within the Orthodox like model, like this is normal for them. And the sort of like edgy pushing the boundaries a little bit are female clergy and yoetzot. That's sort of like pushing the boundary, and like female Orthodox clergy and yoetzot are people who are trained specifically in Jewish laws around women's health issues, menstruation, nida, mikveh, things like that. And so they become expert in that one tiny little field, so that it's kind of like a sliver of like what a rabbi would do, but they don't have the breadth of like study in the way that a rabbi would.
I remember one of my friends was I think he's at Chovave, and he was like, yeah, it's like every year is like 1 year is Shabbos, 1 year is Kashrus, 1 year is Nida. Like that's what they cover, like 3 years. Yeah. That's the big definite. So if you only do Nida, which is like Taharat Mishpacha, like kind of, laws
I hate
around.
That term.
I know. Family.
I teach this stuff and I will not use that term.
I think it's not accurate, but we have,
No, because families look like very different things.
But you can have a whole conversation separate about mikvah and purity and
we will.
menstruation. I mean, we already do, so there's that aspect of it. That's a whole thing. I think that when it comes to like feminism in the conservative movement, because in 1986, so long ago, we started ordaining women, which is like wild.
No, 1986.
86.
No.
So that's only a few years before I was born, which is just wild to me. When I was in school, I literally was like my kind of tefillah teacher, the one who like checked you off and made sure you did everything. She said, "Can you do it this way?" No, that's terrible. Go back and come back next week. You're like, dang it. She would have been the first conservative woman rabbi, but she got pregnant, ironically, and she couldn't finish that year. Otherwise, she would have been the first. And it's just like it's we look around and go, oh yeah, of course there are women rabbis, even conservative women rabbis, but we haven't been doing it that long. It's not that long. Like my own teachers were, and they're not. They could be my parents. Like we're not talking about old, tiny, like 100 years ago. Not 100 years ago. It's a few decades ago. It's not that long. But since then, in the conservative movement, women can be called to the Torah, and they can read from Torah, and they can, be witnesses at weddings, and they can be, witnesses in general, and be rabbis. Of course, you can wear tefillin, you can wear tallit, you can wear kippah, or not, depending on how you interpret your egalitarianism. Those are, so I feel like in terms of women, it's more just, but, so like at a policy level, I'd say like that like all the women achievements have been unlocked. At the synagogue level, the thing about the movement is that we don't go around. There are not like police, like conservative movement police, like, are you letting women do stuff? Every conservative synagogue has their own thing. Like there were literally synagogues that I knew not to interview for when I was doing interview week for rabbi jobs because I knew they didn't take women. And that's 2017, And there were places that I didn't know, and I interviewed anyway. And then afterwards, I was like, "Oh, sorry, didn't know you let women be rabbis." That kind of a experience. But with that, the individual synagogues can decide, as with many other things. That's why you get such a spectrum. I think that at a policy level, what is the movement itself doing? I'd say the next place they're trying to make movements is in the egalitarianism kind of front, like what. Not for women per se, but what does it look like to have a halachic Jewish legal, wedding, ketubah, sheva brachot, if you have two people who are the same gender? Like, what is that wording? Because that wording is important. Legal language is important. In conservative movement, we believe in halakha, and we believe to some kind of extent that it is binding. So we have to make sure that it reflects the people who are trying to live it. And that means, how do we deal with couples when there's two men or two women? How do we, what about people who are transgender? How do you know, okay, is this person male? Is this person female? And, what's their Hebrew name going to be? How are they going to be addressed? And these are all things that the movement is starting to work on, but there's almost nothing at the policy level that exists. So I'd say that's kind of where the shift is going. And we'll see how it goes. I'm very curious, have a lot of opinions.
No, you don't have a lot of opinions.
I have so few opinions,
No.
Both of you know
I know. Okay, so the last question, and then we'll get some in the chat. So how do the Orthodox or the conservative movement find that feminism shifts the space for men?
Alisha, I know you really want to bring men to the conversation.
I do, because it gives me a chance to talk about mikvah.
You'll look for any opportunity to bring mikvah. No, I'm a huge fan of mikvah, and it's something that's like, we've talked about this before, like, where does the reticence about mikvah come from in our respective communities of Orthodox and conservative? And there is a lot of reticence, but from totally different viewpoints, which I find fascinating.
Yeah, so like for me, like I teach this a lot, and like when I teach couples and even just like women on their own, like a lot of times they feel this like burden because all of the preparation for mikvah falls on them. Going to mikvah falls on them. Like, and in Orthodox, like you're counting from when you stop menstruating, like you count out like an extra 7 days. So like all of this falls on the woman in general. And so like a lot of what I do is try to help them find like ways that they can navigate this and include their partner more in this, so that it feels more like a partnership. Like, you know, and different ideas around that. One of the stories that I was telling you about, Rav Schechter Shalomi Zichrono Libracha of blessed memory, that with I don't know which of his wives it was, but one of them, he used to go to the mikveh when she would go, and he would sort of like time and immersion, and like it's not a time bound thing for him. Like he would just go as a way to sort of parallel.
Because I mean, so much of everything comes down to, like, you know, we say a share of it. So did he? Wouldn't say a bracha when he did it.
He would say a bracha, like he's the liberal Jew.
It's not a share kid shana b'mitzvot. I mean, I guess if he's liberal enough, he'll do it.
I mean,
like, if you're talking about a classic Orthodox viewpoint, a share kid shana b'mitzvot v'tzivanu. He's not v'tzivanu.
Yeah, but he's renewal. So like he sort of made us.
Tell us how you feel about the renewal.
No, but I mean, like he can do whatever he wants. Like he's not bound by the same stuff.
You do you.
And I think that like one of the other ways that I think we sort of create like how it shifts things for men is that when you're looking at communities, often like we will often more times for davening or have childcare, because when you have a lot of places with young families, both partners, at least now, like I can't speak to what it was like, you know, like 20 years ago, but like now, like often the communities that I've lived in, both parents want to go.
Oh yeah, for sure. Especially in the more modern ones, like how do we bring both in? I mean, it definitely. Yeah, I mean, feminism does shift the space for men, even in a conservative space and conservative synagogues. I'd say definitely, and it's interesting about like the mikvah part, because I do know. There are obviously far fewer conservative and like pretty much non-Orthodox women who do go to mikveh around menstruation. Far fewer, which we should change because I'm a huge fan of it.
We're working on it.
It's a process. But I do like, you know, a lot of it's, I don't think it's so much it's set in stone, but it's because that's something that dissuades women, non-Orthodox women, in my experience, from going to mikveh. It's because they think like, why should I'm not dirty because I have a period, so why do I need to become pure by going to mikveh? And that's like a whole other big conversation. Like, no, let's reframe. I think that's a wrong way of doing it. But there's also several very interesting conservative to go on mikveh, which they say like that's not the whole point at all. But what they don't talk about in any of them, which I think would be interesting, is, you know, what does a male partner do during that? And if that's that they bring you to the mikvahs, that they, you know, wait for you afterwards. I do know, I know one rabbi couple where he would immerse in the same time that they would make appointments one after the other because we had a community mikvah at our rabbinical school, because it was one that basically everyone in the Southwest who can't come out, who can't come out to UOS, they go to the one in LA. And so they would both go there. I had a teacher who's a rabbi, conservative rabbi, tell me how she just stopped being able to go. Like, she's like, I couldn't stomach it anymore because, you know, after a long day, both of us are working, and I have to take care of the kids, and I'm doing the cooking, I'm doing the cleaning, taking care of the house. And then I would have to like drive out to the mikvah and do all my preparation and then immerse. And I come home, my husband's like watching the NBA playoffs. And I'm like, this is all on me. And it like turned her off so much of the whole thing. She just stopped going. So, but there was a lot of, like, you know, maybe it's sure there should be a male. If you're really stridently egalitarian, does that mean there is a male requirement for mikvah? Because if we take it away from women's menstruation, then yeah, okay, you don't menstruate, but to what extent do you have a requirement? Or do men get exempt from doing stuff the way a woman is if the man is, you know, a primary caregiver of children? That's the idea, like, oh, women are exempt because they take care of children. Well, what if you're a man who's the primary caregiver for your children? Are you exempt from that stuff? You don't have to do it in its particular time because you're the one caring for your kids.
Are there two vote on that?
No.
Okay.
I feel pretty comfortable saying no.
Maybe that's the next frontier.
I mean, it's logical. I think it's like the next logical thing. But I feel like the movement has its hands full with non-Jewish partners and same-sex weddings that they're probably going to back burner. What do we do for men who are, you know? And also, you know, how does mikvah work if both partners are men? And they still want to incorporate, you know, like the sacredness of, you know, sex in a married or, you know, committed relationship. But what if you're both men? What if you're both women? your cycles don't line up. You can never be together, you know, like, how does that resolve?
Like,
and there's nothing, we have nothing on that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So from the chat, you're kind of, this relates to that in a way. There's a couple of questions here, and you touched on it a little bit. How do people who don't subscribe to a gender binary fit into a non-egalitarian space?
Oh, it's such a good question. I think we talked about this with Alicia a little bit about what do you, like Hebrew names, you know, like for, especially for B'nai Mitzvah, and it really comes up a lot, you know, you're going to be called to the Torah for the first time, but what if you're not going to be, you know, thus and such, bat, thus and such, or this and such, you know, ben, thus and such. Like, what if you not, because that means daughter of or son of, like, what if you don't think of yourself using gendered terms for a child of? And there are workarounds. Like, I will say that there are workarounds, but they're not at the policy level in the conservative movement. So you have to find an
but that's also like in the liberal egalitarian spaces. Because the question was like, how do you deal with it in non-egalitarian spaces?
Was it non-egalitarian spaces, or how do you, I mean,
yeah,
it's inherent.
That's the phrasing of this particular question.
Yeah.
But.
So basically, how does someone who's not on the gender binary live in the Orthodox world?
I mean, I think the only person who really wrote about that was Tzitz Eliezer, but he still sees, like, I don't think that he has a category for non-binary. I think he's basically like, he's fine with, like, he deals with trans, and so it's sort of like you fit into one box or another.
To the other, yeah.
You can move from one to the other,
but you can't say none of the above.
Between.
Which is so funny because, like, the Torah is really, there's not really, I would say it's not a strict gender binary. And then certainly in the Mishnah Gemara, they don't, I think most people don't.
Most people just don't touch on this at all.
They don't.
But it's funny because, like Hebrew is super gendered.
It is very gendered. Maybe that's why God's referred to as male and female. What? It's almost like God doesn't have a gender and God has qualities of both. Oh my gosh. Crazy.
Excellent. Where do things stand with the conservative and reform movements about being a strictly matrilineal determination of being a Jew?
Oh, that's easy. The Reform believe that matrilineal descent is a thing and that patrilineal descent is a thing. So as long as you have a Jewish parent, you're a Jew. Conservative movement is if your mom is a Jew, then you're a Jew. That's, you know, I mean, that's actually a much bigger discussion. But
so that's not something, there's no fluidity in there, that it is what it is.
There is absolutely no fluidity in there. None. But I will tell you that there are a lot of conversations happening about it. But we are a movement that has to think a lot about stuff before doing it because we're conserving the tradition, hence the name conservative. So yeah, we're not budging on that one right now.
Are there any women on the committee making rules for the conservative movement?
There are now, not a ton, shocking. But there are women. It's more men than women, not shocking. And there are women who write chuvot, like, you know, the chuvot. I'm most familiar with the ones about mikvah because I did like a whole paper on it and stuff. I think that's why Alicia and I were friends in the first place. And I was like, I wrote a whole thing about mikvah. So there are women also who write policy papers. You know, but there aren't any women in the conservative movement, just to like let you all know, no women on the joint Beit Din in the conservative movement. The joint kind of Jewish, like kind of rabbinic decisors of anything important, rabbis, just specifically in terms of divorces and stuff. There are no women allowed, actually.
Wow. So there's some other conversation in the chat going on that y'all mentioned Blue Greenberg sort of quickly in the beginning. And so tell us a little bit about who that is and what she's written.
Alicia tells all about Blue Greenberg, even though I met her one time and it was awesome. But I think like you have much more.
I don't know that I can say like a whole lot about her. She's written like a lot of books starting in the early 1980s. And she has been like fighting the fight and walking the walk for many, many years. And it's funny, like her husband is Yitz Greenberg, and together I sort of think of them as this like Jewish power couple
They are Jewish.
They're amazing. She's one of my heroes. And, you know, it's a lot of the things that she's pushing for, like it's women's inclusion and it's feminist, and she's also like very much Orthodox. And I don't think of her as
she's an
being
egalitarian.
like,
She wouldn't say she's an egalitarian.
No, she absolutely would not. But I remember flipping to a book of hers that was published, I want to say like in 83 or 85, where she was basically saying like, why don't we have female clergy?
Whoa, that's still honestly such a spicy topic.
I know, but it's sort of like, I was really surprised because most of what I know her for like pushing is the more like middle of the road, like let's push like a little bit at a time, let's have our goals be like small and manageable, so that like it won't feel really radical. I don't think of her as a radical feminist, even though she may have been like in her time, like you know, like in the 80s and 90s, that may have been very radical. To me, it doesn't feel radical, but I also yes, and as Nada Chandler is saying in the chat, she helped with the founding of JOFA, which is Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance, one of my favorite organizations. They're based in New York and helping to do a lot of really wonderful things for Orthodox feminists across the country.
I think it's such a trickier thing doing that because you're operating in a space that is so highly structured around like classic halacha that like you have to tread so much more carefully than and the conservative and certainly, you know, like the other non-Orthodox movements and denominations, that it's not, in terms of feminism, it's just not that spicy an area to be in currently. Not really.
All right, let's wrap up with one last question because we were just hitting 8 o'clock here. And that is, who are your Jewish feminist heroes?
Well, Alicia loves Blue Greenberg, as do I. I saw her talking in Jerusalem once and it was great.
So my other answer actually is Nechama Leibovitz, who is, she's like,
brilliant.
She's brilliant. She's amazing. She's this Orthodox teacher, like was Zichrona Livracha, like a blessed memory. And she used to just like teach Torah, like out of her apartment in Israel. Like nobody questioned it. Nobody gave her a hard time. Like maybe they did. What do I know? But she taught to men and women, you know, and she's held up as this, you know, like model for us of Jewish teaching. Our oldest daughter is named in part for her. So, I don't know, like I love that she was so like quiet and unassuming, and like I think of her as a feminist even if she wouldn't have claimed that title for herself.
Oh yeah, you know, I don't know. I know a little bit about Nechama Leibovitz, and I mean my chavruta, I don't think he's listening, probably not. He poached a whole like her commentary on the Chumash. And we were like claiming stuff at the yeshiva in Jerusalem when we were like studying and living there. And he was like, boop, boop, mime. And I was like, are you serious? So he did the whole thing. I'm still mad at him. It's been years. Still really mad because I really wanted it because she's brilliant and who wouldn't want to have, you know, like a set of her commentary. But I don't think she would have called herself.
No, I mean, she was born in like the 20s or 30s in Europe. Like, I really don't think she would have called herself a feminist.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. But I think what she did for men and for women was astounding. I think anyone who did that is a hero of mine. Anyone who does anything either because they're like, yeah, I'm going to go against the grain and we're going to grow because of it, or because they're like, this is who I am. And if by necessity of who I am and the Torah and the you know, by Torah, I mean like Torah, I mean like Torah, like in your soul, that a Torah I have to bring to the world, then if that changes it, then like, that's what it is. Like, you know, Reb Nimi Feigelson was one of my teachers in school, and she's Orthodox, and she got smicha in 2001 from, you know, Reb Shlomo Carlebach, and she had to keep it secret. And then I think she got smicha earlier. She had to keep it a secret, and then someone outed her in Jerusalem for being a rabbi, and she had like literally that's why she came to America. That she couldn't not be who she was, and if Reb Shlomo thought she was, you know, that he thought she was at that level, she's at that level, and like so she's like, this is who I am, this is who I have to be. And I think that makes her like one of my heroes. And like the women who came before me, every once in a while I think, if something will happen, I think, it's like so hard to be a, you know, woman rabbi now, and something will happen, and it's usually not so terrible, but it's irksome. And I think, you know, as annoying as it can be sometimes, rarely for me, I think about the women who came before me, and I know I've heard their stories, and I think, oh my gosh, like, thank God for them, because their struggle is so much bigger than mine. They're my heroes. Sheroes.
Oh, perfect. That's all the questions. This has been
Thank you.
amazing.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to us talk about something we've talked about anyway for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Thank you for all your wonderful questions. We try to get to them as much as we can. And anything else you want to hear anybody talk about, me, her, both, more, whatever you'd like, let us know, because we want to make sure that everybody gets something interesting and get something out of it. So thank you for being a part of it. And huge thanks to Alicia.
Yay. Thank you, Alicia.
Thank you for Alicia.
I normally just talk to you alone about this.
Oh, you have so much stuff we can talk about. Mikvah's next. It's gonna
The next topic, I'm going to write it down. That's our next topic.
I'm in.
Okay.
That's
How this one happened. It was the lunch and learn, and someone said the phrase, and we went, "Oh, that sounds good," and wrote it down. And
yeah, it really was.
Today, so
that's really what it was. They're like, because it was the women teachers. Was it women getting women being allowed to basically take the rabbi test in Israel? They're still fighting over, by the way.
They're never going to stop.
My favorite part is that the rabbanut's like, we're going to take our toys and go home, and we're not going to make any more rabbis. It's like, because like there's not enough Haredi rabbis in Israel. They're going to, oh no, we're not going to make any more. Like, it's a hollow thread. But good job. Nice try. Yeah, point of the story is they're still not letting women take that exam. Shocker.
So we'll be respectful of everyone's time. Let's wrap it up.
Oh yeah, no, y'all can go. This is just us talking. You don't have to stick around for this.
We can talk all night.
Yeah, I mean,
thanks everybody for joining.
I have to go to bedtime.
Oh yeah, you do bedtime. My kid's already asleep because he's 17 months. Boom. Thank you so much, Alicia. Thank you everybody for sticking around. Thank you, Jennifer, for moderating.
Thank you.
Wonderful
Absolutely.
job. I loved it. Make sure you see the chat because there might be some interesting ideas in there. Can we do that?
I always read the chats.
Okay, make sure they're good ideas. We steal them.
Yes, lots of
We'll give
thank
you
yous
credit.
and lots of good
Good question.
feedback on all kinds of things. So
Awesome.
more discussions, please. Yes, we'll do it.
We love. That's good. We're already good at that.
Good.
Wonderful.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.